Josie Langmaid was late, and she started for school alone because the friend she had been waiting for had given up and taken a ride from a passing neighbor. Her stepmother watched her go. 9:15, Sarah Langmaid said later, under oath, in a courtroom at Concord. It was the last time anyone in that family saw her. She was 17, a student at Pembroke Academy, and she made that walk most mornings with her brother Waldo, who was 16. That morning she had waited for Lilia Fowler instead, and the waiting cost her the company of both. Pembroke was a farming town with a mill village along its lower edge, and the road between them was the road every child in the district used to get to school. Waldo came home in the middle of the afternoon and asked where his sister was. Sarah told him Josie was at the academy. Waldo said Josie had not been at the academy. He had seen the empty seat that morning and thought nothing of it. He had left the house without her and assumed she had stayed home sick. Sarah had watched her walk out of the yard and had not thought about it again because it was a Monday, and in a New England house, Monday meant washing, and washing took the whole of the day. One of them had spent 7 hours certain she was sitting in a classroom. The other had spent 7 hours certain she was upstairs in bed. Neither of them had asked the other a single question about it. By the time they carried that down the lane to the neighbors, the light was already going. Lilia Fowler was a classmate, and she had waited for Josie that morning. When a neighbor came along with a wagon, she took the seat instead. She got to the academy. She does not appear in the record of this case again. Children in that county walked to school as a matter of course, a mile or two each way, with a tin pail for their dinner. Being offered a ride was luck. It was not a rescue, and nobody that morning had any reason to think of it as one. The roads were dirt. In October they were ruts and standing water in the low places, and a wagon could be heard coming a long way off before it could be seen. Academy Road ran through farm lots and low, wet ground, and in places the brush grew to the edge of the wheel ruts. A man standing behind a big tree could not be seen from the roadway at all. 2 people could be out of sight of it inside a few steps. The sources give her walk 2 different lengths. The town history puts the family farm 1.5 miles from the school. 2 later tellings put it at 2.5. In this case, even the distances disagree, and the ones cut into stone do not match the ones that were printed. Somewhere ahead of her that morning, there was a stick of red oak, 1 3/4 inches square and 3 feet 8 inches long. One end had been cut recently. At the other end, the corners had been whittled down so that a hand could close around it. 20 years later, the town's own history gave her one line. The victim was nearly 18 years of age, ladylike, a good scholar, and beloved by everybody. 2 towns spent the next 10 days arresting the wrong men. We follow these cases all the way through, wrong turns included. Subscribe and stay with it. Word went through both villages inside half an hour of her parents speaking to the neighbors. By evening, men were coming in from Pembroke and from Suncook, and by one account, there were no fewer than 100 of them on the ground between the farm and the academy. They went out along the road she would have walked, and then off it, into the lots and the brush around the Giles swamp. The light went early. In the first week of October, in that part of New Hampshire, the sun is down by 5:30, and full dark comes about an hour behind it. 2 accounts of that night say the men carried torches. The town history says lanterns. Either way, the search went on for 2 hours and more, with the ground lit only in front of the man walking it. Daniel Merrill found her. She was in brushy overgrowth, less than 1/4 mile from the school she had been walking to. She had been pulled about 10 rods off the road, and she had been treated criminally, and she was dead. Her head was found the next morning by Horace Ayer, wrapped in her own cape. Her school books were lying by the roadside, a few feet from the place where she had been taken into the brush, and the stick of red oak was on the road. broken into 3 pieces. Her father and her brother were both in the search party. There is a song about that night, and it puts the 2 of them in the woods together at the hour she was found. There were no undertakers in that county and no coroner's rooms. They carried her back to the farm on Buck Street, and the post-mortem was done in the house, with 4 doctors, the coroner Aaron Whitmore, and several town officers standing as witnesses. Dr. George Larrabee, who had been out with the searchers the night before, conducted it. He noted a mark on her cheek made by the heel of a boot, and, because the mark would not last, he drew the pattern of the nail heads on a piece of stiff card. Her books were there, and her cape was there. Nobody made a list of what else she had been wearing or carrying that morning, because nobody standing in that swamp had a reason to think a list would ever matter. 2 years and 5 months would go by before it did. For days afterward, people came out to look. They walked the road as far as the place where she had been taken off it, and they came up the lane to the farm on Buck Street. In numbers, the town history puts in the hundreds. The funeral was at 11 on Wednesday morning. The students of Pembroke Academy walked behind her with crepe on their left arms, and 2 Suncook ministers, H. Dorr and T. H. Goodwin, read the service. Within days, the town had a name. Belle Lake was one of Josie's teachers. She went to the constables and told them that Josie had come to her about a neighbor and that the neighbor had threatened her. The neighbor was William Drew. He was 24, and he lived with his wife in a shack in the woods not far from the Langmaid farm. He had a reputation in Pembroke for saying things to young women when he came across them on the road alone. On the strength of what the teacher said, he became the case. A girl had been killed on the road their children used to get to school. The men who had carried lanterns through the swamp on Monday night were standing in the road by Thursday, waiting for a neighbor to be walked past them. Drew heard they were looking for him. He left the house. They took him on the road toward Concord and brought him back. They arrested a friend of his, Charles Moody, as an accessory. The 2 of them were being walked to the lockup when a crowd came out into the road, ready to hang them where they stood. Drew was then lodged in the jail at Concord, and one of the reasons given for moving him there was his own safety. The Attorney General of the state had by then put a private investigator on the case, Moses Sargent, formerly a captain of the Boston Detective Force, and 2 Boston detectives were working alongside the selectman and Officer Hildreth. As far as the public was concerned, and as far as the police were concerned, that was the end of it. The investigation stopped where it stood. The man Pembroke had wanted to hang spent the following week in a state jail, kept there for his protection, while the man they were looking for went on cutting cordwood inside the same 2 towns. Drew was not the only man taken that week. In the 1870s, a man on the road without work or a settled address could be picked up almost anywhere on suspicion alone. And after the 4th of October, the practice ran hot along the whole eastern seaboard. Constables in 2 states were looking for a stranger with marks on him. John Meyer was taken at Lowell, Massachusetts. There was blood on his shirt. There were scratches on his face, and he had come down by train out of Suncook on the day of the murder. A second man was taken at Raymond, and a third at Pittsfield. In Suncook itself, the officers arrested Charles Moore, who was the only black man living in the village, and that was the reason they gave. Suncook was a mill village, French-Canadian in good part, with brickyards at its edge and tenement housing for the hands. Moore was one man in it. 6 arrests inside 4 days. Against one of them, John Meyer, there was something physical alleged. Against the rest, there was a teacher's account, a friendship with the man that account had named, no fixed address, and, in the last case, nothing at all. 6 men were in custody within 4 days of Josie Langmaid's death. Not one of them was the man who was convicted. By the middle of October, it had all come apart. Belle Lake withdrew her account under oath. The men taken at Lowell, Raymond, and Pittsfield were let go. Moody was let go. Drew walked out of the jail at Concord, and Charles Moore walked out of the lockup at Suncook. The investigation was standing where it had stood on the 5th. 55 years later, in Springfield, Vermont, a woman named Mabel Wilson Tatro sang into a recording horn. The recording was made for a collecting project that had put an open letter in the New England papers, asking anybody who knew a song passed down by mouth to come forward and let it be taken down. Songs that were in print and under copyright were not wanted. The cylinder was wax, and what survives of that first session is hard to listen to. The song was called The Suncook Tragedy. It was set the way those songs usually were, to a tune people already had in their heads. And it told the whole of that Monday, the cool morning, the walk, the search, the father and the son in the woods. Tatro had learned it at home from her mother and her aunt, which puts it in circulation by the middle of the 1880s. Nobody wrote down who made it. She was recorded a second time on the 18th of December, 1958, this time on tape. She was one of 7 people the collectors found who knew the song at all, and hers is the only complete performance of it. Every one of the 7 came from the northern part of Vermont, up along the Quebec line. The collector asked her whether the man had ever been punished. "I've been to Pembroke and Suncook Town, and there's a monument that has been put up for this. Josie Langmaid." On the 8th of October, 1875, the selectmen of Suncook received a telegram. It had been 3 days since the head was found. The wire came from the selectmen of St. Albans, Vermont, 190 miles to the northwest, close to the Canadian line. Selectmen ran a New England town. The roads, the poor, the police money, and the letters to other towns. Josie's own father had held the office in 1871 and 1872. The wire named another dead schoolteacher. Marietta Ball had been killed on the 24th of July, 1874, on a road outside St. Albans, walking to a house she went to every Saturday. A homemade mask, cut out of an old mat, had been found where she died. A man had been arrested on information laid by a man named George M. Lang, brought before 2 sheriffs, and released for want of evidence. He was now living in Suncook. The Pembroke murder had gone out along the whole seaboard, into the New York Times, among others, and it had been read in Vermont. The Boston detectives did not break this case. Neither did the private investigator the Attorney General had hired out of the Boston force. A newspaper going north did it. One account says the name came by wire. Another says 2 men worked it out on their own, the son of his employer and a man named W.N. Abel, at whose house Marietta Ball had boarded. The selectmen of Suncook now had the name. They took him at his house in Suncook. Some accounts give the date as the 13th of October and some as the 14th. Joseph LePage had been born in Lower Canada in 1838, and he cut cordwood for a living. In those 2 towns, that meant feeding the kilns of the brickyards and the engines of the mills, and it was done by hand, with a 2-man saw and an axe. He lived in the French quarter of the village with his wife and 4 of their 5 children. He could not read English and he could not read French, and everything he said to the officers went through an interpreter. He gave an account of the 4th of October. He had been in the woods and he had got lost, and he had been lost for a good part of the day. He had seen nobody, and nobody had seen him. His employer gave a different account at the trial. LePage had been about the shop in the morning and about it again in the afternoon, and could not have been near Academy Road at all. 7 of the men he worked with said the same thing. Both of those accounts belong to the defense, and they cannot both be true. The state had a third. Witnesses put him on Academy Road that morning, and on the Saturday before it, carrying a club or an axe. The French of Pembroke and Suncook said plainly what they thought of the arrest, that he had been taken for being French, in the same month and in the same village where Charles Moore had been taken for being black. They had worked beside him, and they gave him his alibi. Every one of the 7 people who still knew that song a lifetime later came out of the same country, in northern Vermont along the Quebec border. The officers carried a knife out of the house, several pieces of clothing with what looked like blood on them, and a pair of boots. That was the inventory. A jury at Concord convicted him of murder in the first degree in March 1876 and sentenced him to hang. James and Sarah Langmaid were in the courtroom. The highest court in New Hampshire then set the whole thing aside. It went down on the testimony of Julianne Roos, his wife's sister. She had come from Quebec to say that 5 years earlier, he had come at her in a field with a club and a homemade mask, and that she had torn it off and known him. A mask of the same make had been found where Marietta Ball died. The court held that what he had done in a field in Canada was not evidence of what happened on Academy Road, and the conviction went out with it. Chase and Treadwell had soaked the dried stains off the cloth and measured the corpuscles under a high-powered glass, and one of them told the court that the blood on her clothing resembled in every respect that found upon the clothing of LePage. The defense went at the method itself, that soaking corpuscles out of dried cloth changed them, and that no 2 samples could be told apart. Whose blood it was, nobody could say, in a decade when a great many people had reason to have blood on their clothes. Dr. Larrabee's card did better. Set against the heel taken from the house, every nail hole lined up. He was convicted a second time in March 1877. The record on Charles Moore stops at his release, and no source in this case names him again. He held to the account he had given the officers in October. He had been in the woods, and he had got lost. By the spring of 1878, he had been in the prison at Concord for 2 years and 5 months, through 2 trials, a reversal, and a second sentence. He could not read, and he kept a calendar in the cell with a mark on the 15th of March. On the 14th, the day before, 2 Catholic priests of the French parish at Concord came to him, and he made his confession to them. They could take it in his own language. Everything he had said to the officers in 1875 had gone through an interpreter. Before they left, they persuaded him to make it again to the civil authorities. He drew them a map. He had not been on Academy Road at all that morning. He had gone across lots, through the woodlots and the pasture, and the men who had sworn they saw him on the road were mistaken or were lying. He marked a place on the map. They went out with it and dug where he had marked, and the ring was there, and the wallet, and the rest of what had been taken off her. It had been in the ground since the day she died. Nobody had gone looking for it, because nobody had ever known there was anything to look for. Her books had been by the road, and her cape had been with her, and the account of what she had on her that morning had been closed since the 5th of October, 1875. 2 juries had already decided this case. Doctors had been brought up from Boston with a microscope. A heel had been matched against a drawing on a card. A woman had come down from Canada and had her testimony pulled out from under a conviction. None of it had settled anything. He settled it himself by pointing at a patch of ground. He said one other thing that stayed in the record. He had been waiting in the woods that morning for a different girl, a classmate who walked the same road, and she had not come. The priests left him a little before midnight. He stayed quiet for about half an hour, and then he went down on his knees in front of the prison warden and said it in the little English he had. "I kill girl. I kill 2 girl. Too bad. Too bad." He was hanged at the state prison at Concord on the 15th of March, 1878. Fathers Barrett and Millette said the prayers in French, slowly. The warrant was read out. The sheriff pressed the button, and the drop was about 6 feet. His wife asked for the body, and he was buried in the Catholic burying ground at Suncook. Pembroke set up a stone where Josie had been taken off the road. It is gray marble with a carved shield on the face, and the face carries her age to the day. Murdered here on her way to school on the 4th day of October, 1875, age 17 years, 10 months, and 27 days. Another face of it gives directions. The body found 90 feet north at Stone Hub. Head found 82 rods north at Stone Hub. Both hubs are set out in the woods behind it. 82 rods is a little over a quarter of a mile. One of the two stones has grown over. The minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Pembroke brought out a book about her in 1878. It runs to 66 pages, bound hard, gilt on the cover and along the edges of the leaves, small enough to be carried about. It does not name the man once, and it says why. Having lived like a brute, it is fitting that, like one, he should be left in these pages without a name. A week after the drop, the St. Albans paper that had followed the blood evidence through both trials printed its own verdict on it. It must be exceedingly gratifying to Doctors Richardson, Treadwell, and Chase to have this confirmation by voluntary confession of the revelations of crime by the microscope. The microscope had never been able to say whose blood it was. The paper did not mention that. A publisher in Philadelphia brought out the trial as a pamphlet, promising the only correct likenesses of him and of his victims. A shop sold stereoscopic cards of the farm, the road, and the woods for looking at in the parlor. Joseph LePage left a printed trial of 76 pages, accounts in at least 9 newspapers from Vermont to Tennessee, an opinion of the Supreme Court of New Hampshire that lawyers still cite, a grave, and a name still in circulation. Charles Moore left one sentence. Waldo Langmaid died on the 15th of December, 1875, 10 weeks after his sister. He was 16 years, 4 months, and 28 days old. One account gives it as pneumonia. Another gives a fever first, then pneumonia. People in the town said afterward that he had never tried to get well. By 1880, James Langmaid was farming in Minnesota. Sarah was still on Buck Street, entered in that year's census as the head of the household, with Grace, Elizabeth, and Abby. She stayed 11 years before she went west after him. The 3 girls grew up out there. Abby took a degree at the University of Minnesota in 1898 and spent her working life teaching and doing social work. Elizabeth married that same year, and Grace a few years after her. Sarah is buried at Granite Falls, Minnesota. Josie and Waldo are buried on the bluff above the Suncook River, beside their mother and the 2 babies who died before them. Whether the girl he was waiting for that morning was Lilia Fowler, and whether anybody helped him, are not settled by anything in this case. 7 people in northern Vermont still knew the song when the collectors came for it. One of them was recorded twice, 28 years apart. Hers is the only complete one of the 7. Mabel Wilson Tatro sang it into a wax cylinder in 1930, and before she started, she said where she had got it. My mother and aunt sung this when I was young, about 45 years ago. Josie Langmaid was 17 years, 10 months, and 27 days old. Pembroke cut it into the stone to the day.